To our panel. I've got a great panel assembled here to talk to our topic today. On my far right, I've got Claire Wells, who is Director of Legal and Business Affairs at Circle. To her left, I've got Teana Baker-Taylor, who's the Chief Marketing Officer at Coinfloor. And to my immediate right, I've got Juan Llanos, who's FinTech and RegTech lead at ConsenSys. We've got a great topic as well today. We're here to talk about how does blockchain fit within the regulatory environment. Now, if any of you are on LinkedIn, you may have seen Juan's response that it doesn't, but we're hoping to give you a little bit more detail on flesh that theme out a little bit more. Now, some of you might have noticed there's been quite a lot of regulatory change over the course of the last few years. EMEA, Dodd-Frank, MiFID II, GDPR, to name a few. Some might say too much regulatory change. But most of it has been based on trying to fix the ills of the past, rather like sort of shutting the stable door after the horse has bolted. But now we have a new potential paradigm, or a potential new paradigm on our hands. Technology is driving on a pace, and blockchain is opening up new gateways, potential new services, the way to deliver services, new products as well. So the key question is, and the theme that we'll be expanding on today, is how should regulators react? Should we be trying to shoehorn blockchain into the current regulatory environment, or should we be trying to create a new regulatory environment to deal with blockchain and how financial services are provided? And looking at, if we do go down that route, what are some of the benefits and what are some of the potential pitfalls? So, without further ado, I'll kick this off with a question to you, Claire, if I may. Should regulators embrace blockchain within the provision of financial services and regulation?
Yeah, great question. I think first off, I'd want to distinguish between blockchain, DLT, smart contracts, etc., and the actual services or assets provided that leverage that technology. Because in my mind, there's an important distinction there. DLT, blockchain, smart contracts is the technology that provides the services. And in my mind, we need to remain technology agnostic. Much like you wouldn't regulate the internet, but you'd regulate the services on top of that sort of technology or platform. I think the same ought to be applied here. So I definitely think we need clear guidance and regulation in terms of like cryptocurrencies or stable coins or exchange platforms. Those need to be regulated as financial services, but the actual underlying technology ought to remain outside of scope.
And Juan, what about you? I mean, as I sort of preface your comment about whether blockchain fits within the regulatory environment, do you subscribe to that view, or do you think it needs to change?
I think I'm going to challenge that, because I've been thinking about regulation for a long time. And if you think about the abstraction of regulation, regulation in general, regulation is product or sector-based, right? There's regulation for food, regulation for financial services, for different sub-verticals of financial services, banking, insurance, asset management. And then it's activity-based. Also, if there's an activity that fits within a predefined category, that's the kind of regime that applies to you. It's jurisdiction dependent also. It's dependent. Each jurisdiction or division or political division has their own jurisdiction regime. And then it's intermediary enforced. So there's always someone that is an obligated subject that needs to comply with regulation, right? So if you think about that paradigm, regulation by product, by activity, by jurisdiction, and through intermediaries, the blockchain is completely, incompatible with that. It's a completely horizontal technology. Products are fuzzy. We don't know the boundaries between a commodity and a security. And that's why some regimes in the world have attempted to be future-proof and defined categories very broadly, like monetary equivalents, right? If you produce a monetary equivalent, so money or a money-like commodity, so all these things are trying to define things broadly to make jurisdiction regulation future-proof. So what I think is, I think that I agree with what Claire said, that we shouldn't regulate the blockchain itself. But I think we have to rethink that a little bit more, right? Because a product that is produced or that is created on a blockchain is completely different from a product that is produced on a different infrastructure, right? Regulation today is, if you think about regulation, it's created usually after some traumatic or catastrophic event that happened 15 years ago, right? And probably the event happened 5-6 years ago. Regulation happens today. There's a lag, 5 years. And then the product, the activity and the technology has advanced already, so it always comes late. So we have to rethink how we apply regulation and how we define concepts. If you think about securities regulation, just to finish the point, if you think about all of the supply chain or the value chain for securities, you have issuance as an activity, you have the trading, right? And then you have the clearing and the settlement, right? We have these 4 clear segments of a security or an asset, right? And then you have trading facilities, you have issuance mechanisms, you have different segments to what that are addressed or targeted. But now in the blockchain, everything is horizontal. You can issue, a 12-year-old can issue a token in 15 minutes by downloading a blockchain. So how are you going to do that? And what is that token that is created? Is it a commodity? Is it a security? We don't know. So I think that forcing old definitions on assets created on blockchains is a problem.
With a 12-year-old in my house, I'm rather worried that the regulators may come knocking.
Let's be more realistic, 16, 18-year-olds.
And Teana, I mean, just if we go down that route that Juan's espousing, I mean, we've got lots of regulators, we've got people trying to provide global businesses. What worries you about that and sort of regulatory arbitrage?
Well, so I appreciate where Juan's coming from. I don't necessarily see it quite as simple. Certainly, assets being created on the blockchain are different than existing financial instruments today. I don't think that jurisdictions that are putting in place frameworks today are always looking to put existing boxes around new infrastructure. So if you look at Malta, for example, they have not only brought in regulatory framework, but also additional legislature specifically for crypto assets, which differs from their existing law. Now, do I think that we need to create all new everything? I personally don't. And I think that there is a lot more interoperable discussion that needs to happen amongst jurisdictions. Juan is absolutely correct that today we have a number of countries or locations that are coming up with their own, I wouldn't necessarily say future-proofing their jurisdiction for this technology. I think that it's more interpretive, and that's encouraging. From what I've experienced, these jurisdictions are being quite collaborative with industry. And I think what's different from past, where a calamity happens and then regulation comes into place to prevent that from happening again, what I see today is a much more proactive industry pushing governments and regulators to say, without some kind of regulatory certainty, our businesses are failing to thrive or are thriving at a rate that is less than they could be. So for instance, if we had a clear regulatory structure, we would be able to increase institutional investment, especially for institutions that are themselves regulated entities who are sitting on the sidelines and waiting to get into the space, but need more regulatory certainty to do so, to protect themselves and their customers and consumers. The one thing that I absolutely agree with from what Juan has said is that if individual jurisdictions continue to come up with their own frameworks, which a lot of them look very similar, and more often than not, they are principle-based as opposed to rule-based, which is encouraging. But these tokens and the token economy is truly global. And if these regulatory frameworks don't work together or they're not passportable across different jurisdictions, then we're going to continue to see regulatory arbitrage, as you say, which is detrimental for the countries that are slower to come up with some kind of practical way to handle this. And the very few developers that we have and the really genius entrepreneurs that we have in countries that are slower are going to start to see that talent leave. And that's a real worry. I think the additional thing is we're starting to see a shift now around particular exchanges that aren't regulated. Today hold the highest amount of market cap, right? So they're getting the most business, which, when the balance shift and more exchanges become regulated, I think we're going to start to see that kind of reformation, a redistribution of capital, and that's going to kind of change the way the landscape looks.
I even would like to challenge the rules-based versus principles-based thing, but we don't have time. But anyway, just one thing. I think that we come from technology, right? We are, RegTech is about enforcing rules via technology, right? And instead of exogenous regulation, we want systems to self-enforce regulation through technology. So we do need clarity about the rules, and we do need to program the protocols to run a certain way. So I think that we also have to rethink the broad principles-based versus rules-based approach. And I think we have, at the time where we have the opportunity to automate, rules are important. We have to define at least data schemas or semantics for data, things that will allow systems to interoperate in the future.
And does that, just picking up on that last point, does that mean regulators will have much less to do you think?
Absolutely. They will have to work with industry. First of all, they should start hiring engineers instead of lawyers only. It should be more seriously. Why isn't there more diversity in our public services? Why don't we have people from outside that can think outside the box? And we need engineers, we need product people, we need designers working on regulation.
I see that happening, though.
It is in the UK especially,
yeah. And Gibraltar is another great example where the policymakers have said, look, we know we don't know what we don't know. So come in and help us understand this more fully, whether they're hiring those people or they're bringing industry in as consultants. I do definitely see this far more collaborative than I've seen other.
And Claire, from your perspective, if we do go down this route either of lesser regulation or a sea change in the regulation of blockchain in the financial services industry, what are some of the pitfalls that you see? What are some of the things that regulators will need to look out for?
In my mind, the point of regulation is twofold. One is to protect the consumer that's actually using your product or service. And two is to ensure that innovation can flourish within a particular industry. So I'm very sympathetic. It's hard to regulate a revolution. This is a completely unprecedented technology and a completely unprecedented industry in that it's global, a lot of the tech's decentralized, and it would be a huge shame if over prescriptive regulation meant that customers were not getting the best products out there because innovation was stifled. So with that in mind, I think it's important, particularly in this early stage of this industry, that regulators globally come together and say, okay, what is it that we're actually talking about here? What needs to fall within scope of regulation? What can fall within scope of new regulation? And how do we define it? So the work that GDF is doing on the taxonomy of these digital assets and a code of conduct as to how players in the ecosystem ought to operate, I think is really important to help shift the dial and a great starting point.
So just a final question, which I'll pose to you first, Teana, but please all chip in. If we had our crystal balls, what do we see in the short to medium term for the regulation of blockchain?
Well, I think in the short term, we are going to probably continue to see another maybe 4 or 5, this is really kind of a guess, jurisdictionally based kind of future thinking areas come up with some frameworks. And I would say probably certainly in the next 18 months, we will see the enacting of the 5th Anti-Money Laundering Directive, which has provisions for cryptocurrency. I think that will be an important change. I believe in the next 3 to 5 years, we are going to see some interoperable global framework, whether that's
It's not going to happen in the United States, where I'm from. Nothing's going to happen in the United States.
But also to be clear, the hope is that blockchain will not be regulated, right? It's the assets, it's the services, it's the protocol. Yeah.
One thing that may happen eventually in following on that interoperability is that I think that everything is going to converge in the concept of monetary equivalent. If you can trade a fraction of a condo, a fraction of a Picasso, a fraction of a stock issued on a token, on a blockchain, all of that is going to be fungible and interchangeable. So people are going to wonder, oh, now I can send a fraction of a Picasso with my mobile. Is that a security? Is that a payments instrument? Is that what is it? So I think that everything's going to converge into a simpler category. And that is going to be freaking out some regulators.
Now, with that, I've just seen some questions pop up on Slido. So maybe we'll take the... so what happens if the gap between technology exponential and regulation linear and geometric continues to accelerate in the 21st century, which is sort of a theme which we've just been discussing? I don't know, Juan,
I think technology will win eventually. You know, the power technology of open source technology or crowd technology is much higher than centralized political systems.
I think that is true. If you, I think that can be true. The one thing that I would caution, and I'm just saying this as a bit of a devil's advocate, not necessarily because, you know, I certainly don't hope that it happens, but the government controls electricity. If they really just get sick of this, if we don't play nice to some degree, they'll just turn the lights off. They will stop giving us electricity.
Yeah,
so do keep that in mind. There is
a
single point of control, and there will be for the foreseeable future. So it's better to try and solve the problem from within, in my opinion.
It'd be quite a nuclear button to press, even for Donald Trump.
Just turn the lights off. That guy would turn the lights off.
But I mean, I don't disagree with that. I mean, the thing that I've always struggled with, going back to Juan's point, is that, as you said, the regulation and regulators regulate people. So if you've got these decentralized networks, who are they regulating?
Right.
But you're always going to have a server in a specific location. You're always going to have governing individuals in a specific location. I think the myth of like a decentralized, like people aren't decentralized and people control how technology...
Yeah, but it's a question of whether the regulators can get to them though, isn't it?
Right, and the peer-to-peer paradigm is completely disconcerting to regulators because they need intermediaries to enforce the rules. So how are you going to regulate on a peer-to-peer basis? It's a challenge. So that's why we have to go into the technology and become more technical and try to decide as a society what's important for us. Is it to maintain a bureaucracy or to protect society? I'm being sarcastic.
But correct me if I'm wrong. I think that one of the things that I've heard you mention before is that if we can design for self-governance in a way that isn't just us self-attesting that we're doing the right thing, but is actually demonstrable, right? We can say, this is what we said we were going to do,
Correct.
This is how we're demonstrating that we're going to do it. Then that allays that fear.
Absolutely,
right?
and the trade-off for that permission to self-regulate should be full transparency. You cannot just claim that you want freedom to code your own controls and then not allow people to vet you or to monitor you. We have to be transparent. A new society needs to emerge here, and that is less political.
Well, that's clearly on the theme of the last question around traditional democracy being compatible with blockchain democracy. Just looking at the one above that, do we think code is going to become law? Is blockchain going to replace contract enforcement property rights? Claire, is our resident...
I don't think so. I think if you think about, the purpose of law is to help dictate how people, or the encode sort of morals and ethics into how people ought to interact with one another. And I think at this stage, it's too early to leave that to AI or some form of code because you still need the human aspect to actually ensure that those interactions or sort of cause and effect actually have the appropriate cause and effect?
Code is a language, right? It's an instrument. So the law is what comes out of that instrument, right? Or the rules. But I think that enforcement is going to be automated. The law will be designed by humans always and should be monitored by humans, but the enforcement, the actual compliance on the side of the industry and enforcement on the side of government should be automated. That, I think, will have enormous impact on becoming, as Nick Szabo says, reduce the subjectivity, human subjectivity, and the whims of strangers.
But I think that subjectivity is the beauty of particularly the UK. I'm getting geeky now, but particularly the UK legal system. We have a jury that actually puts someone on trial if something. And so,
but there is resolution of conflicts. I'm talking about an API requires deterministic inputs and outputs. So the API, which is, it's a protocol and requires a specific data set or data component in order to function. Of course, humans should resolve problems and differences, but the actual enforcement, the execution of the enforcement should be automated, and that requires prescription.
Great. Okay. Well, I've just been given the sign. We'll have to draw stumps there. We'll finish the penalty shootout, just to go back to our football analogy from earlier. So if I could just ask you all to join me in thanking this great panel for a really interesting session.
Thank you. Thank you.